And when we go through our day, there can be so many things in our weeks and in our jobs and in our families be like, but what about this? But God, what if I can't make this payment? God, what if I can't navigate this? God, what if I can't repair this relation? God. And God's like, it's okay. Continuing on in verse 2, it says this, that he lets me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. I actually love the ESV translation of this. It says that he makes me lie down in green pastures. You know, sometimes God, when you're going 1,000 miles an hour, is going to say, hey, be quiet and take a nap. Do you know a nap can fix a lot of things? It's actually biblical. Isaiah was really angry at one point, was complaining about everything, and was talking about how depressed he is and how he wanted to die. And God said, hey, dude, just go take a nap. And when he woke up from his nap, he was in a way better mood, okay? It's literally in the Bible, okay? It's like sometimes we just need to be still and we need to be quiet. And God's like, dude, just chill out, right? You have a really good night's sleep and all of a sudden you realize the world's not as bad as you thought it was before. But when you're really tired and angry and kids screaming at you, okay, you're a little bit more, on edge on there. But God's like, sometimes he just makes us lie down and he makes us be quiet and he gives us rest. But then that builds into verse 3. So when we get up from that, when we come out of that quiet time, what does he do in verse 3? It says he renews my life. And listen to this, he leads me along the right path for his name's sake. Meaning God doesn't just say, hey, I want you to have some quiet time to yourself so you can become more enlightened, so that you can have a plan for your life. God's like, no. I want you to rest, chill out, let that anxiety go, and I'll show you the way forward. And David is acknowledging this as he's talking about how God provides for his needs. He's like, hey, God, you have it figured out. God, I can rest on you. You are my shepherd. I don't have to provide everything for myself, but I know that you will give me what is necessary to live. And more importantly, you'll guide me on where I should go. Which leads to the next thing that David shows us through Psalm 23 about God and how he starts to wash our minds and he reorients our hearts to him, is we also see that God protects us wherever we are. Pick back up in verse 4, he says this, that even when I go through the darkest valley, he says, I fear no danger, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. David here references the tool of a shepherd. The tool of a shepherd is they would hold a rod or a staff. And if you don't know much about shepherds, you're like, why did they have that? Because if you probably picture a shepherd or you Google a shepherd, the first thing you're going to see is they're going to hold this sweet little staff in their hand, right? And little known fact is they don't all have a limp, okay? So that's not why they need the staff. Or it's not just because they walk long distance that they need that staff to lean on. That staff, the purpose of it is when a bear or a big cat or a wolf came to take one of their sheep, they would bash that thing in the teeth with a big old stick. Yeah, makes it a little more legit now, right? Shepherds ain't just sleeping on the job. They're hitting animals in the face with a rod, Gandalf style, okay? They said David killed lions, right? And he probably used his staff to knock it out and then probably cut his head off just like he did Goliath. Anyway, it'd probably be pretty awesome. But he's saying this is the rod. He's like, hey, this is a big deal. Okay, this rod and this staff, it's not just for show. It's not just for looks, but it's literally to break things and to fend off all the dangers that are going to come against our sheep. Now, what does that mean for us today? Because we don't have lions lurking around the corner waiting to take us out. But the biggest fear and the biggest threat that we have to us today is death. And here's the deal, no matter how brave you are, no matter how courageous you are, no matter how even deep and holy you are, there's part of you that is always going to fear death. Death is scary. And the more you think about it, you're going to get more and more scared. But David kind of says time out here. He says, hey, we don't have to be afraid of death because we have a shepherd who has defeated it. You read this in light of the New Testament. As Jesus as the good shepherd, as Jesus through his life, death, and resurrection, he has destroyed death. He has taken the rod and staff of a shepherd and he has beat death to death. That's a cool turn of phrase, right? That it's no more. It doesn't have the same power over us. It's not the predator looking to come at us anymore. Instead, that God has defeated it. He has protected us from it. And guess what? This stacks up because not only will the dark times of life not be so scary because that looming enemy of death isn't upon us because God has overcome it, but in verse 5, he kind of one-ups and he builds on this imagery and he says this, that you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. You see, through these first four verses, this imagery that David's been using is God as a shepherd. But in verse 5, he kind of switches images a little bit here. Because when he's talking about a table and he's talking about a feast, what he is now presenting is God as a king. And he's saying, God, you're preparing this feast. You're preparing this whole place that we can eat and that we can celebrate. But he's saying this, that you have prepared it in the midst of my enemies. Now think about this for a second. If you're in the middle of a war and all of a sudden the king comes out to his troops and puts a table in the middle of the battlefield and say, let's eat, while the enemy is out there waiting and watching you, that's kind of like pretty disrespectful. It's kind of like a little lackadaisical and be like, dude, we're in the middle of a battle. But David's saying, no, God, you're doing that because you know you've already won the war. And he's saying, not only are you this shepherd that protects me, but you're this king that will set up a table in front of my enemies and be like, hey guys, we're all right because we've already won the war and they can do whatever they want, but they won't even touch you. And he expands on this more. He says, you anoint my head with oil, meaning he's saying that you are my guest, that you are honored in front of me. And then he's saying my cup overflows, meaning that you are going to have more joy. You're going to have more satisfaction than you can ever imagine. And what David is saying is that when most people would feel vulnerable and defensive, God is hosting us as guests and saying, come dine in my presence because everything is okay. That I know it looks grim. I know it looks hard. I know that the world is telling you to be scared and your life seems like a train wreck. But when you're in my presence, I promise you are fine. And you see, he's singing and he's praying this song that God, you protect me so well that my enemies can't even touch me. He's saying, God, we have so much anxiety, but God, you take that away. This past week, we kicked off our Bible groups. And Tuesday night is the group I attend, and Matt is our leader in that group. And one of the things he said as we were kind of studying last week's psalm that I love is he actually said he gets annoyed with me sometimes. Imagine that. I don't know why I'd ever say that. We're actually about to coach T-ball together tomorrow, so we'll see if we get annoyed even more. Probably at the kids and less at each other, right? Like, stop playing in the dirt. Okay, that's going to be fun. But he's like, because we'll talk about life. We'll talk about all that's going on in our world and politics and this. And like, dude, did you see this meme? Did you see this? Is our world blowing up? Like, what's happening over here? And he's like, but you always say at the end of the day, you know what, it doesn't matter. Because that's ultimately not what's important. But God's in control and his kingdom is going forward no matter what. I should say that as the pastor, right? Okay. Just be less doom and gloom. And he's like, you always come back to this. I want to complain about how terrible our world is. And then we say, you know what? It's okay. Because if America falls, if our culture gets worse, if this happens and that happens, it's all okay because God is in control. And David is saying exactly the same thing. David's saying, hey, I'm walking through a valley, it's dark. God, I'm going and I'm so scared. God, I have all this around me, but he's saying, God, it's okay because I know you are protecting me. And when we go through our day, there can be so many things in our weeks and in our jobs and in our families be like, but what about this? But God, what if I can't make this payment? God, what if I can't navigate this? God, what if I can't repair this relationship? God. And God's like, it's okay because I am in control. Because I am your shepherd, I am your king, and no matter what comes against you, God has our back. Which leads to our very last kind of point that we see in this psalm is that God, he not only protects us, God not only provides for us, but God also promises us what we will have. Check out verse 6. And we sang this in our songs this morning over and over again. We saw these elements of this psalm here. But he says this, that only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. I love this verse here because here's what's happening is God is telling David what is going to happen in the future. He says this, only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life. So David throughout this time has been saying, hey, God, I know you have my back. I know you're protecting me. But David's being honest. He's like, I am scared. There are times when things are going to be hard. There are times when I look at it and David's like, I see the enemies coming. And he's like, God, I'm going to be scared. But verse 6 reassures you. He's like, hey, David, time out. Only goodness and faithful love will follow you all your days. David, it's not going to be destruction. David, it's not going to be travesty. David, it's not going to be fill in the blank, but only goodness and faithful love will follow you. Apply this to us today. You open the news, you open social media, man, the depression just flows in. You open social media and it's like, hey, there's another gender that's being discriminated against. And you're like, what are we going to do in our world? Open God's word, he says, hey, only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life. You open the social media and be like, hey, there's another disaster. We're gonna die. There's a big disease going across our world. The world is gonna end. And then we open our Bibles and God says, only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life. You open the news story and you see more violence in our cities. You see more violence. Don't open the neighborhood app, okay? That's just destined to be like, someone else broke in my car and I'm gonna die. You see that all the time. Then you open God's word and he says, only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life. And we go and we see another political promise. We see this, we see that, and we become depressed, we become scared, and we open God's word and he says, only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life. Here's what David's getting at, is our world does not have a very bright vision for our future. You listen to our culture, you listen to politicians, you listen to our world, our planet's gonna blow up, our kids are gonna be a mess, we're all monsters, we hate each other. The list can go on and on and on and on, whether you're on the left or the right or in between. It is depressing. But God's like, you wanna hope for the future? I'll give it to you right here. Only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life. You want a positive vision for your future? That's your positive vision, that I don't have to be wrapped up in the stress and the anxiety and all the garbage around me. But if I follow God, that I will see goodness and faithful love abound in my life. But how do we get that? Well, he tells us. He says, and I will have this, and this will happen because I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. You see, when we dwell in God's house, when we are among his presence, that positive vision for our future begins to take place. Now you might be thinking in your head, okay, so can I rent out a room here in the church? No is the answer, okay? Unless there's like an old storage closet you can fill that's filled with junk, then you can make that your room, okay, back there. But he's like, no, he's not talking about a physical building here. He's talking about the presence of God. And you know how you experience the presence of God? It says where two or more gathered, God is there. That the presence of God is present when God's people, the church, gather together and do life together. And David is saying, hey, if I want this positive vision for my house, I need to go be with God and I need to go be with his people. And for us today, if we want to experience this amazing blessing, is exactly what we talk about here all the time. We make Jesus known in our lives, but we do it through community with one another here. As it starts here, as we dwell together, we do life together, and out of that flows these blessings that God talks about. Now, maybe you hear that and you're a little skeptical. Because I just had a conversation this morning. I'm like, hey, is so-and-so going to be here? They're like, they don't really do church. You know, they did church for a while, but, then like some things happened. Some people were people, and all of a sudden, like, they just don't really like church anymore. And I've heard this over and over and over again. Church is tough. Church is hard. You know why? Because people inside of churches, they suck. Because they are just like you and me. And I've heard this all the time is church people are judgmental. Church people just aren't nice. Church people are cliquey. Church people are fill in the blank. And I'm like, yeah, and you are too, okay? But here's the thing is David talks about this, not to be reliant on the church, but to be reliant on the God that the church praises. Throughout the Bible, God is often described using all different sorts of imagery. For example, God here, and we've seen some of these throughout the psalm, he is compared to a lion. He's compared to an eagle, a lamb, the sun, a light, a fire, a fountain, a rock, a hiding place. And even in psalms like today, it gets more personal, where he might be called a bridegroom or a husband or a judge, a king, a warrior, a builder, a maker, a physician, and a father. And many of these are names and images that we've seen in these psalms and we see throughout the Bible. But in this closing psalm, what I love here is this God we have studied as we see this picture, this provider, this protector, this promise keeper in the form of a shepherd king. And you see this shepherd king who invites us into his presence, who says, I'm going to look after you, I'm going to provide for you, I'm going to protect you, and I'm going to show you a brighter vision for your future. He makes it possible to live this way. And as we close out this psalm today, here's the chorus that I want you to hear over and over and over again, that David is preaching and screaming and praying and singing out to his God, is this: that God is with us. He is with us in fear and in hope. Listen to that. He is with us when we are afraid out of our minds. When we say, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know if this is going to get better. I found out, a couple months ago, I'm having a fourth kid on the way. I don't know how I'm going to afford it, okay? That is fear right there. Yeah, you're clapping for that fear, right? But then the hope that comes along with that is like, hey, I'm having a fourth kid. This is awesome. And God's with me through all that. God is with us in our sin and in our righteousness. Man, when we sin, do we feel just pathetic? We feel so low. We feel like we've missed it so bad. And Satan loves that. He's like, you're not worthy to be in God's presence. He doesn't want you. But it's the opposite. He says, no, I'm there beside you. And he's there beside you at your lowest, but also in righteousness. When you start to be transformed and become more like him, to be more like our Father and our Shepherd King. But God is also with us in our failure. When we feel like we've hit rock bottom, when we feel like we've burned too many bridges, when we feel like we've hurt too many people, he's like, no, I'm beside you. But that same God is with you when all of a sudden it turns and it's successful. And all this we see in our fear, in our hope, in our sin, in our righteousness, in our failure, in our success, that our shepherd king is always there. He has his staff. He has his rod. He's there to fend off the wolves, to break the teeth of those who would come against us, but to also nudge us in the right direction, to show us that he has provided all that we need. So we don't have to rely on ourselves or anybody else, but we can rely on our God and find true community in him. A funny story about sheep. I told you they're super dumb and really worthless creatures in some ways, if you think about them on their own. But when it rains, sheep are full of wool. And I didn't really know this, but they'll fill up with water. And if a sheep is alone when it's raining, they will fall over and they can't get back up. They'll literally die there. So when it's raining, here's what a good shepherd does, is a good shepherd gathers all his sheep together. And even if there's just one other sheep, they can brace and kind of almost bond together and they won't fall over. But they'll be together in this pack so that when the rain comes, when the wind blows, when life throws all this at them, they'll have that community to stand firm together. And in Psalm 23, we get this picture of our Lord, the shepherd, that he has protected us, that he has provided for us, that he gives us this vision of the future, but he gives it to live with one another. My urge for you today is to stop trying to do life alone. Stop trying to do life apart from God and apart from his church, because you will fail. You will get hurt. And our world has nothing to offer you like our shepherd king does. Are you ready to follow him today? Are you ready to join the pack in the group of his sheep and see your life transformed in a vision for your future that you can't even imagine?